Hi, can y'all hear me okay? Okay. So my name's Adrienne, and I will be presenting on sex addiction, a literary and yogic perspective this evening. Sex. The word alone holds a razor's edge. When voiced, the word sex carries the ability to cut through the air, lingering in the atmosphere, offering a mix of both curiosity as well as discomfort. Sex is a topic that is reserved for certain environments amidst specific company, while grossly being avoided amongst other connotations. Sex is a topic that is gratuitously shoved in the face of society in numerous ways, yet hypocritically holds an essence of taboo. Sex is complex. It is sacred. It is a place of desire that can offer immediate gratification and yet stoke fears of longing and emptiness long after the satisfaction has occurred. Sex, although wrought with various meanings, collectively holds a great deal of power and effect. Sex is an act of both carnality and holiness. Sex can equally tear down and build up. When sex is reduced to just a physical act, sex becomes selfish. Intimacy is non-existent, identity is sought in unhealthy ways, and people are treated as commodities versus the fascinating, complex souls that they are. In today's society where hookup culture abounds, the line between sexual promiscuity and sexual addiction is paper thin, and yet such a line does exist. My thesis seeks to offer insight into the disease of sexual addiction overall and what in fact does delineate it from sexual promiscuity, seeking ways to mitigate such behavior by exploring not only the symptoms, but the underlying issues as well through a yogic whole body perspective. Furthermore, diving deeper into such an application, specifically under the context of the yamas and the niyamas, and investigating how both might not only serve as therapeutic tools for sex addicts, but perhaps allow for a healthier approach overall to sex in the modern world. Sex addiction versus sexual promiscuity. According to the American Society of Addiction Medicine, addiction is defined as a treatable chronic medical disease involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences. People with addiction use substances or engage in behaviors that become compulsive and often continue despite harmful consequences. As with any diagnosed addiction, sexual behavior becomes problematic when sexual engagement is pursued regardless of the ensuing negative consequences. Sex addiction is not currently included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and there is some debate amongst healthcare professionals whether to view it as an addiction versus an impulse control disorder. Despite there being no current universal agreement in defining sexual addiction, scholars argue that the disorder remains the same regardless of what it is called, and it affects an estimated 12 million adults today. The term sex addiction or hypersexual disorder are used to encompass various types of problematic behaviors, including excessive masturbation, cybersex, pornography use, sexual behavior with consenting adults, telephone sex, strip club visitations, and other behaviors. Sex addiction can materialize in various ways, including but not limited to seeking such experiences in person as well as online. Studies have shown that the most watched hours of porn worldwide is around 3 and 4 in the morning, highlighting negative aspects that accompanies those struggling with sex addiction, such as insomnia, as well as depression and anxiety. Sex addiction is associated with increased risk-taking behaviors, for example, substance use and multiple sex partners, as well as impulsivity, loneliness, low self-worth, and insecure attachment styles. Those struggling with sex addiction are more prone to relational issues, emotional withdrawal, guilt, isolation, and feelings of emptiness as well. Clients often struggle to truly engage in intimate relationships, which is typically the result of a lack of attachment to a parent or guardian throughout childhood. At times, the addiction becomes a way to make up for this important component that they're missing. Sex addiction becomes a strategy to survive if the sexual addicted individual experienced childhood trauma. It becomes a type of dissociative disorder as a result. Sexual addiction is not about sex, although needless to say, sensual pleasure plays a role. It is about reassurance and avoidance of pain. A recognized lack of internal resource sheds light on the fact that self-esteem issues are a root cause of such behavior. Other symptoms can also arise, such as anger and loneliness. Sex addiction is a psychological disorder. Looking at the delineations that set sex addiction apart from sexually promiscuous behavior, it is important to note the problematic aspects that can arise due to numerous sexual engagements being driven by those previously mentioned root issues. This begs the explorations of these root causes and motivation of such behavior on a deeper level, seeking to find the similarities, if any, that exist within that of sexual promiscuity and sexual addiction. Regardless, when reckless and devalued, sex is reduced to nothing more than a physical experience, and as previously stated, turning those involved into disposable commodities. As a result, the value of the human life is being reduced to simple anatomy. The main difference that separates sexual addiction and sexual promiscuity is the compulsive behavior that exists within the mind of an addict. Sex today. In 2017, Liberated, the new sexual revolution, aired on Netflix, offering a poignant perspective in today's sex culture. This documentary explored the lines between pop culture, gender identity, hookup culture, and sexuality as a whole, with its opening line being, "Nothing quite prepares us for the struggle of identity and intimacy in this world." When exploring the topic of sex, intimacy and identity are unavoidable inclusions in such a conversation, and perhaps it is within such topics that a healthier approach to sex can begin to take place. When first looking at the concept of identity, one must acknowledge a slippery slope that exists from the way society defines sex, even more specifically with the masculine and feminine definitions that have been curated by today's culture and the differences in how both genders approach sex. Benjamin Nolot, the director of Liberated, writes, "We must create a world where men are loving and respectful and where women are valued and safe. And only then will we disrupt and eliminate sex trafficking in our world." One of the key takeaway points from his documentary is the acknowledgement of how pop culture, hookup culture, and rape culture are separated by delicate threads that inevitably bleed into one another. For some people, sex has been reduced to such an animalistic pursuit. When people rely on external sources to provide internal meaning, fulfillment is futile. Once we decide who we are, then we will naturally work out our actions, attitudes, and behaviors to manifest our person. But if we don't settle this in our hearts, then two things most often occur. First, we begin to look to other people to tell us who we are. This leads us to becoming whatever others need us to be to fulfill their imagination. Soon we find ourselves in the very dangerous place of developing intimate relationships with people so that we can draw strength and self-esteem from them. When identity is rooted in others, sex simply becomes an extension of such, turning it into a desert of temporary affirmations and ego boosts versus a place of depth and restoration. Brene Brown, a qualitative researcher of shame and vulnerability, notes, "There is no intimacy without vulnerability. When intimacy is absent, vulnerability can be misused. Standing naked in the presence of another without true emotional intimacy that is rooted in a mutual vulnerability can quickly turn the atmosphere into one that is shameful and uncomfortable, perhaps even fearful. Sex becomes one-sided, taking on the goal of getting versus giving. The key difference between selfish and unselfish sex is found in the way it is separated from that of a carnal, animalistic act to one rooted in love, but even more importantly, in how the other person is viewed. If there's not a recognition that the other person is made up of more than just a physical body, but of one that houses an emotional, mental, and spiritual body as well, how is it any different than animals? Instinctive urge for sex pleasure and for procreation belong to the biological level of one's being. It is alike to men and animals and to all biological life, but a human being cannot remain peaceful with a biological existence. Surely we can rise above mere carnality. When sex is rooted in selfish pursuits, true meaningful connection disappears. John Rechy is a modern American novelist. His book Numbers offers an excellent expose into the psychological aspect of sex addiction. The thirst that never seems to be quite quenched, the satisfaction that is always just one more hit away. While a fictional story, Numbers offers a gripping narrative that does not hold back. Instead, it presents a unique, door-wide open perspective into the mind of a sex addict. And while the book does not talk about Johnny Rio, the main character's childhood or potential issues that have gone left unresolved, it is alluded that such pains do exist. A scared child, and he was a very scared kid, though he put up a tough front. Johnny would often go to bed saying a rosary, secretly embarrassed that anyone should know in order to drive away the unfocused Black fears. Without justification or judgment, Johnny Rio's story is told, and at its conclusion, the reader cannot help but feel a weight of unsettled sadness. The haunting reality that regardless of his efforts, Johnny Rio is ironically both victim and perpetrator of the cyclical cycle that ultimately will never truly offer the reprieve he is so desperately seeking. The treatment for his non-disclosed underlying issues is the only way to remove himself from such, and yet to venture into such a place of health and wholeness, he must risk the one thing he never will, vulnerability. Despite the desire of salvation, sexual addicted individuals do not demand too much medical support based on the shame that they feel. In general, they apply to psychiatrics with suicide attempts, depression, or anxiety symptoms. The need for specific treatment options for those suffering with sex addiction is clear, specifically ones that address the whole person. I believe yoga's whole body approach is a way to facilitate such needs. According to the Yoga Sutras, the practice of yoga starts in the mind. Sutra 1.2 reads, yoga is a restriction of the fluctuations of consciousness. To quote unquote do yoga, the physical body, the mental body, the emotional body, and the spiritual body must all be acknowledged. Such an acknowledgement not only recognizes the differences of each, but also the relational effect each one has on the other. The mind and body are inextricably linked with a complex relationship between the two known as the mind-body connection. Just as how we treat our physical body affects our mental state, our minds can also positively or negatively affect our biological functioning. When we change our thinking, we change our beliefs, and when we change our beliefs, we change our behavior. The physical and mental bodies are undeniably connected. And in the same way the mental and physical bodies can alternate between a co-pilot and pilot relationship, the same can be true between the physical and emotional bodies. The spiritual self must be acknowledged as well. There's a whole universe that man in all his wisdom is ignorant of. That is the world of the spirit. And I'm not just talking about the spiritual realm outside of us, but also the spiritual being inside of every person. Maintaining an awareness of the spiritual component of life helps one walk in accordance with a higher standard that goes beyond the carnal, selfish motives. The spiritual body helps create a checks and balance of sorts among the physical, mental, and emotional bodies and propels us towards a sense of self-awareness and ultimately an overall wholeness. For it is only in first knowing one's own identity that the ability to know another's is then made possible. And as a result, meaningful connection and intimacy are made plausible. Yoga-based approaches use a series of postures and breathing techniques to build a sense of connection to the self. Yoga practitioners are able to cultivate the ability to remain present, to notice, and tolerate inner experience, and to develop a new relationship with their body. This body-based practice then has a ripple effect on emotional and mental health, on relationships, and on one's experience of living in the world. However, there must be space created for such a journey to self-awareness to take form in the first place. And that journey inevitably brings us back to vulnerability. The yamas and the niyamas of yoga offer a right way of living according to the Yoga Sutras, specifically through the text, Yoga of Sex Sublimation, Truth and Nonviolence by Swami Mayananda. I will be looking at the first three yamas. This author currently lives in Miami, Florida, and is the founder of the Yoga Research Foundation. Ahimsa or nonviolence is the highest of all the virtues according to the sutras. It is the foundation of all yamas. It is also the vital spirit behind all niyamas. An act that is believed to be ultimately rooted in ego and a lack of self-awareness. It is written that a reliance on egoistic life is what initially causes violence to develop within oneself. In day-to-day relationships, a practitioner of nonviolence must behold the higher self abiding in all beings. Ahimsa is the opposite of reducing people to commodities. Instead, it is not only recognizing human life, but more importantly, dignifying it. Following ahimsa is the second of the yamas, truthfulness or satya. But without truth, it would be impossible to observe any principles or rules in life. It is believed that within the practice of truth, ego is eliminated and love exists. Moreover, when practicing truthfulness, one becomes aligned internally. For in such harmony, self-awareness is feasible, and as a result, self-control is then made possible. This brings us to the third practice of brahmacharya, control of sex, the urges. Brahmacharya is an integral part of yoga. It is an indispensable factor for divine union or blissful samadhi. Sex urge is a creative force. Direct the sex energy to the higher spiritual channel, and it will be sublimated. It will be transformed into divine energy. While brahmacharya is most associated with control over sexual energy, it can also house a more general connotation regarding self-restraint. It is not about removing one's sexual energy, it is about redirecting it in a healthy way. Ultimately, brahmacharya is the ability to house a perspective that goes beyond the physical realm. Self-awareness and self-restraint go hand in hand, and both are necessary parts of an addict's healing process. Yoga and mindfulness as complementary therapies for addiction. It is suggested that the skill, insights, and self-awareness through yoga and mindfulness practices can target multiple psychological, neural, physiological, and behavioral processes implicated in addiction and relapse. Creating an environment where those struggling with sex addiction feel seen and acknowledged versus judged and shamed is the first and foremost starting point to offering tools towards restoration and healing. The second priority lies in addressing the various components that make up the human life. An example of such an application is seen in Yoga 12-Step Recovery, an organization that specializes in using yogic practices and principles to specifically navigate addiction. Their website reads, "The characteristics and effects of addiction can easily be described as separation. Addictive behaviors disconnect us from ourselves, our loved ones, our environment, and so much more. Conversely, yoga itself means union, integration, balance. Yoga and its practices teach the fine art of balancing our multidimensional lives while living in a complex world. As aforementioned, the driving factors behind such behaviors seen in sexual addiction as well as sexual promiscuity can run deeper than mere physical fulfillment. Anything that masters you is an addiction, and it will eventually destroy you. Addictions grow in the basement of denial. Denial means that you avoid the root issues that cause pain in your heart by covering them up with pleasure. That's the reason that sexual addictions are rampant in our world. The value of acknowledging the underlying currents that motivate unhealthy behaviors and certain lifestyle choices is imperative if wholeness and restoration are truly to be found in one's life. At the heart of it all, each of us possesses a longing to be seen and known. To have the capability of seeing another, one must first hold the capability to see themselves. When exploring the multifaceted layers of what it means to be human, we venture beyond mere carnality, but soar into the full divinity of who we were created to be. To be human is a gift full of complexity. It would be a great disservice to treat anyone less in the fullness of what this means, especially within themselves." Thank you.